Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, yeah. Trying to get started. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I have to finish their conversation here. Hope everyone's doing well. Let's go ahead and pray and get started with this morning's lecture on 14 through 17, part 2 review of the book of Revelation. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to come together again, to focus on your word together, to learn, to study, to grow, to know, Lord, your desire for the future and what you have in store for history. Pray, God, that this would be an instructive time, a time, God, where we can reflect on what you have revealed to us by your word. And may we use that as motivating fuel to look towards the future and see the bright hope that we have in the midst of these circumstances that you've detailed for us through John. We love you so much for it. It's in your son's name. Amen. All right. So last week, I'm actually feel better. My nose isn't running around this room. Yeah. So I'm back and ready to go. So last week we had looked through chapters 14 to 16. We looked at the bowls of wrath. We looked at a couple of scenes in heaven and tried to detail some of those things that were happening. I think it's important for us to do a review every now and then because we're looking at a lot of details, right? Especially in this book, which could be very, very confusing in some aspects, very difficult to understand. So it's important to kind of go back and highlight some of the mountain peaks, especially within the last half of this review. Okay. So today we will be going through chapter 17 and 18 respectively and looking at some of the details there. All right, go ahead and do this. All right. So one of the particular challenges that I had mentioned at the start of our discourse was that chapter 17 and 18 are heavy with imagery, right? Lots of things going on, lots of big picture things. It seems like there's lots of figurative language happening, and it can be really difficult to kind of recognize all of these things and try to figure out what they mean just at a glance. It is heavy with details, heavy with aspect. There's about 4 or 5 different aspects or perspectives within this particular section, specifically chapter 17. Okay, so it's easy to get confused about what's going on. However, yeah, here we go. Yeah, come on. I know you want to work for me. There we go. My objective in looking at these particular chapters 17 to 18 was to work from the macro to the micro. Understanding the universals of this chapter makes it easy to understand the particulars of this particular chapter. By the way, that's just as an aside, that's good rule of thumb for anything that we learn, right? To try to understand the big picture and then looking at the small details in relation to that big picture, it makes a lot more sense. Okay? So we had looked at some questions that we asked specifically of chapters 17 and 18, if you recall, about a month or so back. What do the images in this chapter represent? What do they mean? Right? Do they is this talking about an actual woman who's riding on a beast, or is this a reflection of something that John is trying to communicate to the reader? What are the aspects of time, and why do these aspects matter? As we'll go through in chapter 17 briefly, why do these aspects of time matter? What are they connected to? Right? Who is the great harlot? Right? This imagery in chapter 17 and 18, right? Revelation talks about this great harlot riding on a scarlet beast. Who is this harlot? Who are the seven kings in this chapter, as well as the 10 kings? And why is this chapter here? Why is it here, right? Why is it not in chapter 5 or chapter 6 or chapter 10 or chapter 12? Why is it here specifically? Okay. And we sought to answer all of these questions, and we will do so today as well. We looked at the microcosm, right? So defining and fleshing out some of the characters and some of the imagery in this narrative. It mentions the great harlot or the prostitute in verses 1 and is described in verses 2 and 7. We don't necessarily have to go deep into the text to figure out who this harlot is, right? It talks about the kings of the earth in verse 2. There is also a reference in verse 12 of chapter 17. And it talks about those who dwell on the earth, verse 2. Now, we've seen this phrase all over the book of Revelation. We know that every time we see this phrase, this is specifically talking about unbelievers, okay? And the scarlet or the red beast, which is described in verse 8 of chapter 17, right? So we have all these particular characters mentioned here. We have the seven mountains and the explanation of those mountains and what they are in verses 9 and 10. Again, we don't have to go beyond the text to know what these are. John, by way of the Holy Spirit, tells us, and the messenger tells us who they are. The 10 horns and the explanation of the 10 horns is in verse 12. The seven mountains are not the 10 horns and vice versa. They are very different. Then we have the Lamb in verses 14 of chapter 7. And again, we know who this is. We don't have to debate about who this is. We know from the words that we've seen in previous chapters who this is. We have an explanation of the waters. The waters are mentioned in verse 3 of chapter 17, but now we have an explanation all the way in verse 15. And of course, we have God mentioned in chapter 17. Okay. We had discussed at length the key to understanding chapter 17 is describing what Babylon is. If we mystify or spiritualize Babylon, we will have a difficult time understanding this chapter. Okay? But if we keep Babylon the way it is and use it consistently through the text, it's almost like the Rosetta Stone of chapter 17 and 18. I mean, it's just easy for you to understand. Okay? As a matter of fact, Babylon, this is the third time that this word is used in this book. We've seen this word Babylon before. Revelation chapter 14, verses 7 and 8 is its first usage. Right? And Revelation chapter 16, verses 18 to 19 is the second place. It is those two places where it's used, it is referred to judgment, that the judgment of Babylon is coming. And this word, when it is used, always, we took a real good look at this. When it's always used, it is always used to refer to a city or a geographical location. It is not used to refer to any spiritual malaise that people have or some type of spirit that influences the culture. It is used of a city, a geographical location. The image of Babylon itself, described by the messenger that is telling John, is personified. It is a personification as a prostitute. Again, we talked about the vocation of a prostitute. It is one of the most detestable vocations. Oh, I'm sorry, sex worker. We have to use that these days, right? It is the most despicable vocation. And the messenger uses this imagery to John to show that this city itself, Babylon, is a bad influence. It's a shameful individual. We see the name on her forehead, which is found in verse 5. It says, chapter 17, and on her forehead was a name written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abomination of the earth. Right? She is the source, the epicenter of all idolatry. You wouldn't be able to go into Babylon without seeing some trinkets, a plenty of gods, of individuals, of their own imagination and their imaginings, and all of the detestable things that this idolatry is associated with. Right? So we talked about that. Again, the great harlot is Babylon, right? Again, why is this chapter here in this part of this historical account? Well, these images represent the aspect of time where this messenger, this angel that is speaking to John, will specifically talk about the judgment of Babylon. We've seen it in chapter 14. It's highlighted in chapter 16, and now the messenger is going to go into great detail about this city and its ultimate destruction. That's the whole point of these two chapters. Okay? Then we get into the aspect portion of this, which was very cumbersome, right? We talked about the 7 mountains in verse 9. Right? Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings, right? People who have rule and authority. 5 have fallen. We talked about this, right? That this refers to the reference of the past. And I made a case that these individuals, these 5 kings, are not empires specifically, but they are individuals who rule and govern over specific empires. They're not talking about the empires themselves, but the rulers of these individuals. And I mentioned that these 5 kings more than likely started with Nebuchadnezzar, and we looked at some of the Old Testament passages that reference God giving the world basically to Nebuchadnezzar and his rule. So we talked about the Babylonian Empire and how it was great under massive and large and influential under this king. And then we talked about the second king, Nabonidus, who's not mentioned in the text, but Belshazzar, who's mentioned in the book of Daniel, is. As a matter of fact, all of these particular kings are referenced in Daniel. We talked about Cyrus the Great and Ahasuerus, whose vice regent was Darius the Mede. So Nabonidus was the king of the Persian Empire, but Belshazzar was the vice regent, the one who ruled on behalf of Nabonidus of Babylon, which is why he's mentioned in Daniel. And same thing with Darius the Mede. Okay? And then the 5th king to rise and fall was Seleucus I Nicator, which was a successor to Alexander the Great. I believe that these were the 5 that have fallen that this passage speaks of. Which fits quite nicely with Daniel, especially the last 2 chapters. Then we looked at the one who is. So verse 10, and there are 7 kings, 5 fallen, 1 is. And I was approaching this one with fear and trepidation, right? We looked at a couple of commentaries, and a lot of them had basically underscored that the 1 is talked about the Roman Empire, right? And so we looked at this particular word estin, right? Present active indicative third person. And we looked at the frequency of this word. We spent a lot of time talking about this one phrase, is, that's translated in the text, estin. Okay? We looked at a couple of usages too within the Hebrew scriptures as well, and how this word is used, and it is always spoken of in the present tense. We looked at one specific detail of this word estin, that this word estin does not seem to be in a future sense, but it is speaking present when John is writing and dictating this book. It's speaking about his present time. It's not speaking about some time in the future. But when he is writing, it's speaking of the present time where John is writing. It is, matter of fact, the word itself, estin, when speaking of events, is always discussing something current. Always. Okay, specifically pointing out something else among things, or is referring to something else. For instance, the woman is Babylon, so on and so forth, right? But when it comes to events, it's always talking about something current events. Not from our perspective, but from the perspective of the writer. Okay? It's very important. We also looked at another historical fact too, which when I was doing research, it kind of shocked me when I was looking at this, was that the Roman Empire, which seems to be the hub and central focus, it is the power, it is the great power of the West at that particular time period, had great influence, massive power. We sometimes assume that at that time, the Roman Empire was the only empire at that particular time period, but that's not true. As a matter of fact, the Roman Empire, although expansive and massive, did not control Babylon. It did not have Babylon at the time. Matter of fact, there was another empire that stood alongside of Rome. And I had mentioned that in our discourse in chapter 17, and that was the Parthian Empire. And wouldn't you know it, the Parthian Empire has a history with Seleucus I. When Seleucus I died, it was passed over to them, and they held that empire ever since. Okay? And remember, Seleucus I was the ruler of Babylon, right? At the time when Alexander the Great died and passed it to his generals. So here we have the Roman Empire, which is on the side, you can see very vast, right, in its influence, but we have the Parthian Empire too, and right there is Babylon, right there. Very fascinating. As a matter of fact, it might even be said that this might even be the rise of where the 10 kings are, but that's another story for another time. So the one who is, I believe, is not Babylon. It is not Titus Flavius. It is not the ruler of Rome at the time in AD 90. I mentioned that as well. But it is Pacorus II. It fits with this because he's the ruler of the Parthian Empire at this time. Pacorus II. We read about him. He is the king of Parthia. He was the son of the Parthian king Vologases, who ruled from 51 to 78 AD. Okay? And during the last year of Vologases' reign, Pacorus became the vice-regent, very similar to Darius the Mede and Ahasuerus, very similar to that setup. And right when Vologases died, Pacorus II became the ruler. Again, he sought, that is, Pacorus sought to expand trade throughout Asia, India, and all the way to the Mediterranean. Okay? Which is why his empire was very vast as well. Not as vast as the Romans, but pretty big. When I made this case that it was Prochorus too, I gave you a couple of things as to why I believe this makes the most sense than some of the commentators that we looked at when we were looking at chapter 17, specifically the one who is. I mentioned that all the kings are discussing their association and influence over Babylon, and by extension, the city of Babylon. And if this aspect is present, that is, from the aspect of the writer, right? If this aspect is present, then this is the only option. Right? Because we've already discussed the past with the 5 kings, and we will discuss the future here in a little bit. It would seem that there is suffering happening against the Jewish believers, not just in Rome, but in Babylon also. That's one of the reasons why Peter details this, right, in his letter to the Jews, specifically those who believe, that are scattered all over the known world at that time. Then we talk about the other that is not yet come. So the 5 have fallen, one is, and the other that is not yet come. That's what the messenger now turns his attention to. We talk about the aspect of the messenger to John that relates to the future, the one who has not yet come, right? And again, the other who has not yet come is related to the city of Babylon. This is, again, verse 9, right? All of these rulers, in one sense, have had control or influence over this, either this particular region or specifically the city. We see that we talked about the beast of the earth and the beast of the sea, and we compared both of them, right? Which beast are we talking about here? Who is the one to come? So we looked at some of the details. We went back to Revelation chapter 13 and looked at some of the details of the beast of the earth and what he does, performs signs and wonders to deceive the whole world in following the first beast, and commands unbelievers to make an image of the first beast, right? And then directs individuals to take the mark. He's the one that does all this stuff. Then we looked at the beast of the sea and saw that he was actually the one who has the influence and power, as the dragon gave his authority to the beast of the sea, right? So it would appear that the beast of the earth, for all the power and influence that he has, plays a more subservient role to the first beast. I believe that the beast of the sea in Revelation 13 is what's being discussed here. That the details in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 10, parallel this activity, or the one here from the beast to come. That he has the authority of the dragon, which is why he rules the world system. He severely injured and healed of his injury. This is kind of a false resurrection type deal, right? He's worshipped by the unbelieving world, not the beast of the earth. The beast of the earth is not worshipped. He directs everyone else to worship the beast of the sea. And the praise of this beast by the world, right? Who can conquer this beast of the sea? Who can overcome him, right? And then of course the beast's God complex, which is described here. So from this point here, we see the description of Babylon being a destructive influence on the world itself. We see the history of Babylon outlined essentially from verses 9 and 10, right? And the rulers, the influential rulers that have ruled over this particular city. And there will be one who will come once more to do that. And that will pale in comparison to the others. Let's keep it moving here. Then we talked about the 10 horns, right, which is found in verse 12 and following. It discusses another detail in the image that John saw concerning the beast and the prostitute, and that is the 10 horns. And the 10 horns are described as 10 kings. This is found in verse 12. Again, we don't have to guess who these individuals are. We know who they are by the description of the text. And they don't have authority right now as of this point, right? But they will as the beast will give authority to them for 1 hour, right? That's verse 12. And these have one purpose, one mind, one goal, and they are to give their power and authority to the beast. We talked about the consolidation of power that the beast will have in lieu to these 10 kings. They are vice regents over this area, right? And this is how he consolidates his power through intrigue and influence. Then we read, what's interesting in verses 14, right? That these will wage war, that is, these 10 kings will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them because he is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. This is a fascinating and interesting title, couple of titles here. And we were able to kind of give the explanation of some of these titles. We looked at the Lord of Lords. I find this one very fascinating. This is used 3 times within the Greek scriptures. This title is also used in the Hebrew scriptures. It is always used to refer to God himself, the Lord of Lords. As a matter of fact, when we went through the Hebrew scriptures and saw this title, Lord of Lords, it always refers to God. Always. And yet the messenger dictated by John, writing this down, uses this phrase to refer to the Lamb. Okay? Again, demonstrating that the Lamb himself is God. Fascinating. It is also used of Paul. This title is used of Jesus' second coming. We're getting there. We're coming up on that chapter here real quickly. And it connects the fact to show that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. My goodness. Again, then we looked at the phrase King of Kings as well, right? Let me go back to it. We looked at the phrase King of Kings as well, right? And we looked at the history of that, and that this title, King of Kings, actually finds its origin in Babylon. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar was called the King of Kings, Cyrus was called the King of Kings, and things like that. It seems as if this title is taken from Jesus himself by the messenger to show the ultimate superiority and authority of Christ as the ruler. That no one else deserves that title except him. He will claim that title for himself. Amazing. Continuing here, why does the beast and the 10 kings despise the city so much? We read in verses 15 to 16 that the 10 kings and the beast, or the 10 horns and the beast, will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked. Why do they despise the city? It seems that, they're kind of in on the thing. Why do they despise the city? And we looked at some Old Testament references and things like that paralleled this, and we concluded that the great city of Babylon is a threat to the beast's rule and power. Again, this guy is a madman, right? He wants to consolidate his power at all costs, so he invades, plunders, and seizes the city and claims it for himself. Then John finishes up the chapter, which gives the description of the woman that is, who is the great city. And then John gives the reason as to why the kings of the earth are overruled by the beast. We see this in verse 17. For God has put into their hearts his purpose by having a common mind or a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. We talked about the sovereignty of God just for a minute when we had finished up and looked at all the ways that God would influence the heart of kings to do his will. We first looked at Pharaoh for this regard, right? And looked at some verses there, and then I made the case that this does not influence common people, right? This specifically has to deal with the guidance and the direction of Israel, and how God would demonstrate his power to the world so that men would know who he is. This is the same thing. God is orchestrating this to demonstrate his power, and that the beast and the 10 kings, they're nothing. Right? He's using them as an example to show that he is God and they are not. So then we looked at the plan in a nutshell of chapter 17. After we looked at all of the characters and all of the things that were happening, we kind of put this sketch together, kind of stitched this timeline, if you will, very tacit. Okay, it's not comprehensive. There might be some things out of place, but it gave us kind of a bird's eye view of what this is all about. The image John sees is a historical sketch of the history and influence of the city of Babylon. Right? The city is the heart of this chapter. The beast rises to power and proclaims himself to be God. At some point, he sees the city of Babylon as a threat to his rule. So through intrigue, the beast offers power and influence to the 10 kings at this time. And in exchange, that they assist him in overthrowing the city of Babylon. Hell, I'll give you some power if you just help me take this over, the city. Of course, they agree and invade the city. Okay? Their sole purpose is to consolidate the power to the beast, right? That is the one purpose they have. And all of this activity has been placed there by God to accomplish his purpose and ultimately judge all of these people as an example of his rule. Now we jump to chapter 18 very briefly. And chapter 18 is an extension of 17 and gives us some detail as to how Babylon ultimately falls and the response of everyone when it does, right? It would appear that this divine messenger is once more emphasizing to John the destiny of this great city. And it will imprison unclean spirits and birds of prey. Owls, vultures, hawks, things like that. That after God is done judging this place, it will become a wasteland. No one will build there. No one will establish anything there. It will become a byline, a look at what God did place, right? We read throughout chapter 18 that a voice from heaven continues to speak of the charge as to why those who live within Babylon's walls ought to flee. We looked at some Old Testament passages, right, talking about individuals coming out of Babylon, flee from this place, right, because its destruction is near, which goes to show you that there are individuals, Jews, that are perhaps living in Babylon at the time, that will seek refuge and escape there because of its destruction. Then we read of a review of the strong angel and the voice in heaven discussing the acts, judgment, and destiny of Babylon. It's essentially a rewind and a repeat of all the things that are mentioned in chapter 17. This is the detail how rapid the destruction and how intense, by the way, the destruction by the hand of the Lord will take down this impenetrable city. You see all of the reaction and the response of these people in the chapters. They're just gobsmacked, awestruck, right, at what they see, how it's taken down in such a short amount of time. Individuals, merchants, ship sailors and shipmen who are looking at this and just seeing the destruction at a distance and cannot believe how it's being destroyed and taken over in such a short amount of time. It says the kings of the earth will look at the carnage and devastation of what the Lord has done to the city. We read about that in verses 9 and 10. They will examine her smoke. They will examine the carnage, and they will lament. In verse 10, it says, "Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." Right? Then it mentions the former position of the city, showing the perspective of these kings, as I just mentioned. And we looked at the phrase 1 hour, right? Is this a literal 1 hour? Is this a season? Is this a long period of time as described as 1 hour, right? And so we had to ask the question, how is 1 hour used in this passage? And then we read that in one day Babylon's plagues will come. Are these related? Are they different? Are these different aspects of time? What are we talking about here? Well, we looked at the usage of the word 1 day and 1 hour, and we concluded in a very exciting conclusion that that's just what it means. 1 hour is 60 minutes, right? However you want to say it. 1 day is 24 hours, there it is. 1 hour tells John, and by extension the reader, how long it took for the Lord and his calamities to directly destroy Babylon. That's the reason why the earthquake is so fierce. It levels everything. Levels not only Jerusalem, but this city too. Okay? Heat rocks coming down, destroying everything. Right? The 1 day tells John the effects of what happened. Now, it's hard for us to comprehend because we've never seen anything like this, right? I mean, we've seen earthquakes and things like that have devastated cities and towns and everything, but never an earthquake that has leveled everything, even mountains and islands sinking. Everything's leveled, okay? Except for one place. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 19. The 1 day tells of the effects of what happened. So famine, calamity, pestilence, all of that stuff happens due to the effects of the judgment of the Lord. Okay? Then we see the merchants and their response of the destruction of Babylon as they look on and see from their sailing, bringing in cargo. Again, think about this too. They are sailing on blood. Remember, these judgments are still there. Okay, it's not like the blood is, the judgment has come and then it's gone. No, they're sailing their ships on this stuff. Okay. They will stand at a distance because of the destruction. They will see the weeping and mourning. There's a lament from the merchants that are similar to the kings of the earth. Oh, how great is this great city? It's destroyed. Why is it destroyed? Right? And then we see the response of all of the shipmasters, the passengers, the sailors. Everyone is in shock. This is found in verses 16 and following. Okay. And then John tells the messenger about a third lament that is similar to all the other laments as we see here. Basically, when you see things repeated more than once, the damage is extremely severe, right? And the reactions are severe. Last paragraph in chapter 18. The strong angel takes up a stone and throws it into the sea and sinks it down into the depths of the sea. The nations were deceived by Babylon's witchcraft. Pharmakia is the word here. This is why the nation of Babylon is destroyed the way it is. It occurs 3 times in the Greek scriptures and 2 times in the book of Revelation. Okay? This is more associated with idolatry and all of the practices that a false deity demands on its people to perform. Okay? That's the result of witchcraft. Okay? Or divination is what is so often used. It is associated with the acts of the nations, with Babylon and Revelation and the merchants, and it is specifically severe here. Right? Again, I would submit to you that we've never seen and we will never see anything like what is going to take place in the city of Babylon. It's going to be next level stuff, right? It's going to make, again, your satanic worshipers, I mentioned this several times, these satanic worshipers in this day, these are amateurs. These are, they're gonna make these guys look like Boy Scouts. As a matter of fact, it's so severe, it causes the murder and saints of the prophets. So you can imagine, the people of Babylon bringing saints in, right, to be tortured, hung on poles, right, by impaled, things like that, used as toys for individuals. It is going to be that type of hostility. This is also underscored in these acts of Babylon. And this is why the chapter ends with the destruction and the razing of the city of Babylon. God is taking judgment against those who have spilled the blood of the saints and the prophets at this time. He's enacting vengeance of the blood and guts type. This causes the kings of the earth and the conqueror and the subjects, when God destroys Babylon, he razes it to the ground. He makes it an ash heap because of all the money and the power and the influence that the city has. And it's all gone within a matter of an hour. It's done. The conqueror and the kings become furious at this, right? Because part of his influence is taken away. So, what will they do? They will seek to destroy Israel and assemble for the final battle at the plains of Megiddo. This is, if you have seen The Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, this is a Helm's Deep type moment here, okay? Because where is Israel? They are in the mountains of Judea. Okay, and of course you got others of them scattered around, and we have men upon men, 10 kings and their armies ascending on the plains of Megiddo, right next to the mountains of Judea, getting ready to duke it out here. So if God does not come through for the nation of Israel, the world is toast. Israel's toast. It's done. This brings us to chapter 19. This is where we will begin to start to look at some of the details of chapter 19 next week. Okay. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we will close for this session. So many details, Lord, within this text. Your word is so rich with detail, and it makes everything clear. Thank you for revealing this to us so that we not only know our future, but know the future of the world itself and where it leads. and how you're going to make everything right. I pray, God, that we would stay connected to this word that you've given to us, that we would become people of eschatology, that we would not be afraid to talk about these things and to think and ponder on these things, because these things give us perspective on how we are to see things clearly and how we are to order our life. Thank you, Lord, so much for your word given to us. For it's in your Son's name. Amen.